Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guests, Dr. Andrew Budson and Dr. Elizabeth Kensinger, who are here to share with us their new book, Why We Forget and How to Remember Better: The Science Behind Memory. So welcome to the show, Dr. Andrew Budson and Dr. Elizabeth Kensinger.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Oh my goodness. As soon as I saw this book, and we've had other great discussions, I knew we needed to talk. So what is the inspiration behind this book?
Well, I think we each had our own sort of reason that we wanted to write this book. I had, as you know, started writing a book for older adults and what they could do in particular to make sure their memory was working well, and what they should look out for if it looked like they were heading down that path towards Alzheimer's. And then I wrote a book to help families whose loved ones were really in the middle of Alzheimer's or another dementia. And I knew that I wanted to write one more book, and this one would be for like everybody else, everybody who is younger, middle-aged, who wants to understand how does their memory work and what could they do to make it better. So those were sort of my reasons, but I knew that Elizabeth was interested in writing a book like this too.
So I think my experiences as a college professor had really led me to realize that even people that were in the full-time job of trying to learn things didn't know a lot of the science-backed tips that could actually help them to do that more effectively. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity to present that information in a way that I thought would be accessible and engaging, and get it into the brains of the people that are learning every day.
Well, I'm so delighted that the both of you were so inspired to collaborate and write this book. So why don't we start with the beginning? Like when we talk about memory, is this a more complex thing? Because most people think, well, I just have to remember what I did yesterday and what I had, to eat for dinner.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the very interesting things about memory is that, there's actually different memory systems in the brain that help us to remember, like what you had for dinner last night, which would be different than like what's the temperature that water boils at, which would be different than like how how to tie your shoes. And, all these things are actually using, different parts of your brain. The learning for each is going to be a little bit different. And, the whole mechanisms are going to be different.
Did you want to add anything to that, Elizabeth?
Sure. I mean, I think that was a great answer, but I'll just add on that I think this idea that we can remember something in one system and forget it from another can actually explain a lot of the kind of mysteries that we can have of memory. This idea that we can know how to tie our shoe, yet have a lot of difficulty clarifying out loud exactly what we're doing, or similarly, that we can have an emotional reaction walking by some area and yet not consciously remember what it is that happens. Those are all examples where we've remembered in one memory system, but forgotten from the other.
Can you explain the different ways we remember and what those are called?
Sure. So when we're thinking about memories for events or episodes of our life, we usually call that episodic memory. And episodic memory allows us to almost literally time travel back in our minds to where we were and what we were doing when we had that episode of our life. So if I think back right now as I'm doing to the dinner I had last night, I actually was over with my wife at a friend's house, and we had takeout Indian food. And I can, envision, the sights of the food, the smells, the taste, the nice emotions I was having at the time. And, all of that sort of richness, that's what sort of characterizes one of these episodic memories, a memory for an episode of our life. And then there's a real different type of memory that we call semantic memory, which is our memory for things that we know. So the word semantic means meaning. It's like the meaning of different things. Like, if I think about some of the things I was eating with, I was eating with a knife and fork, and it's like, well, what's a fork? It's like we all know what a fork is, but it's unlikely that we remember where we were and what we were doing when we first learned what a fork is. And so we can no longer time travel back then. So we've lost that, right? Presumably it was when I was a little child that I learned that. And so instead, we just have the knowledge that this is a fork. It has these 3 or 4 tines. We use it to either stab or scoop. And it's separate. It's no longer connected to any event or episode of our life. And then, if you're going to keep information in your mind and manipulate it, we're using working memory. We're using memory where we're making it work for us. And the classic example is to remember like a phone number in your head if you have to, transfer it, before you're going to touch type it on your phone or something like that, when you're repeating information in your mind. Or if you're to plan a route in your mind of like how to go around a traffic jam. Of course, we all use Google Maps these days and you don't need to worry about it. But if you had to use it in your mind. And then the last type, the type that would be tying your shoes or riding a bicycle or touch typing on your keyboard, you'd be using procedural memory because it's memory for different procedures that you're doing. And these procedural memories, once they are formed, we don't actually remember the learning process. And this is one of these interesting dissociations that Elizabeth was referring to, where, we may, know perfectly well, how to touch type or how to, tie our shoes or drive a standard transmission vehicle, but we may have actually forgotten the steps in which to do it. Our fingers know what to do, but our conscious mind may not remember the steps of what we're doing.
So what happens when we get to a point where one of these memory systems isn't working for us? I know some people who can remember when they were 2 years old and things that they did, and other people who, they have no idea what they were doing it to.
I think the fact that there are these different memory systems that are involved in each of these different types of memory means that we can all experience that unevenness, where we can have some aspects of memory that are very strong, and then other aspects of memory that might not be as strong for us. And we can also see as we age, or with a disease like Alzheimer's disease, that we can also see shifts in terms of which of those memory systems are going to be most affected. So, we talk a bit in the book about the fact that it is often surprising to witness someone with Alzheimer's disease or other dementias who might maintain the ability to play the piano beautifully, who might be able to recount childhood experiences in a lot of detail, and yet who might have a lot of difficulty remembering something that happened last week or yesterday. But it's really those different memory systems that are involved. So they're playing piano because that's relying on procedural memory, and they're remembering those childhood narratives because that's actually now more semantic knowledge. It's facts about our past lives oftentimes. Whereas the more recent memories are relying on episodic memory. And so while that is more extreme in terms of the types of distinctions we see in Alzheimer's disease, many of us can experience those sorts of distinctions where we can have relative strengths or weaknesses across the different memory systems because they are relying on different brain regions and different neurochemistry.
Now, do illnesses or mental illnesses, or I'm sure brain injuries probably do, does that affect our memory as well?
Yeah, they can affect memories in a lot of different ways. And maybe I'll just comment on some of the more common mental illnesses. and such as depression and anxiety. So depression is a situation where it can be a little bit more difficult to learn new information to start with. It's when we're remembering something, we need to be sort of engaged with it. We need to pay attention, and it can be difficult to sort of be engaged, to allocate the attention if one is feeling depressed. And also during depression, it can be difficult to retrieve memories that take effort. It tends to be sort of effort dependent. And it's an interesting contrast to Alzheimer's in that, as Elizabeth just mentioned, in Alzheimer's, the memories from long ago tend to be easier to recall than the memories that happened yesterday. But because for the person who is not suffering from Alzheimer's, it's actually easier to remember something that happened yesterday than something that happened 40, 50 years ago. Most people with depression have trouble recalling information from the past because it takes effort, and have an easier time remembering things that happened yesterday. And maybe I'll just mention COVID, because that's something I think is often on people's minds and how that affects memory. And then I'll let Elizabeth talk about anxiety, because that's something that she knows a lot about. So COVID is something, of course, many of my patients have come in concerned about, as well as friends and families and people I meet. And COVID can affect memory in a lot of different ways. I first want to just mention even just the social isolation that most of us experienced for a year or more actually isn't good for your brain. It turns out that staying social, staying active, being out with people is really important. And no one really knows if the sort of virtual Zooming and being on the telephone, like how good is that as a substitute. I'm sure it's better than nothing. But it really is important to be out there. So the social isolation in and of itself is not good for one's overall memory and brain health. But then COVID can do some specific things to the brain. Sometimes it can affect the brain cells directly. Many people have lost their sense of smell because of damage to some of the nerves in the brain. A few people, luckily not many, actually have direct damage to the brain, either from encephalitis or from strokes. These can both happen. The strokes tend to happen to people who are at greater risk of strokes, meaning that they may have had other strokes in the past, or they have heart disease, or they're older. But all of these things can affect the memory. Luckily, most people who have had COVID, their brains do make a full recovery and their memory goes back to normal. But it can be difficult to get new information in, to recall information quickly, to keep information in mind. All of those things can be more difficult if one is in the acute or the recent post-acute phase of COVID.
And I'll just add to that, as Andrew mentioned, about the effects of anxiety and anxiety-related disorders. And so, at one kind of extreme are individuals that have post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, where they're, unlike the way that we've been talking about memory as being an effortful process and where it can, take a lot of work to think back to what happened previously, for individuals with PTSD, those trauma-related memories actually come to mind involuntarily and spontaneously, and often in response to really irrelevant cues. So most of the time, it's that we're walking past a restaurant, and that's what makes us think about the last time that we ate at that restaurant, or there's some thought that we had where one thought leads to another. And so you can kind of a bit track the path of a memory and what led you to think of it. In people with PTSD, that's not the case. It's often an irrelevant context, and suddenly this memory has come to mind, and it's usually very vivid. It also, though, can be interestingly fragmented. So it's difficult for people to coherently re-experience the entirety of the event. And it's instead often just these very small snapshots, or this feeling that something, again, isn't holistic and coherent, but instead has this fragmented aspect to it. And that's a really interesting feature, because that's something that to a milder extent is true when we have memories that are associated with higher anxiety, even if we're not suffering from PTSD. So there's a lot of work indicating that when we experience a high level of emotional arousal during an event, that actually what that does is it causes our memory to have a lot of detail about some aspects of the event, but actually very poor resolution and very poor amounts of detail for other aspects of the event. And so that's why we can end up with someone who perhaps remembers exactly what a weapon looks like, but doesn't remember the face of the perpetrator, doesn't remember what street they were on, that weapon focus effect as it's referred to. But that can happen across a whole range of different types of emotional experiences, and can actually happen for highly positive memories as well as highly negative memories. So if we have a memory of a wedding proposal, we might actually have a very specific memory only for, what the ring looked like or something like that. But we might actually have lost some of the context about more generally, where were we? What was the environment? What was the weather like? Some of those details may actually be filtered out.
Okay, so I've got a lot to unpack there, Elizabeth. You've got some things there I want to talk about, both of you. So when we talk about our memories, is everything we remember true?
Definitely not. And in the book, we talk about memory as being a cycle. And I think that when we talk about it in that way, it can help to understand why it's actually the norm that memories are going to have some slight distortions in them. And we refer to it as a cycle because we are always going through this process of first having to take all of the components of an event, and we refer to it as encoding. That's the scientific term for it, literally creating a code that the brain can store. So you can imagine having to take an element, getting it down into all of its individual building blocks, and then knowing that all of those blocks go together. That happens in the process of storage, where it's as if we're writing blueprints to say, these are all the building blocks that were together during this event. These are the sights, these are the sounds, these are the smells, these are the emotions. And this is the location in which it took place. The blueprints say that that's everything that happened during that event. But then later on, when we want to bring that event back to mind, when we're retrieving that memory, we actually have to use those blueprints and we have to rebuild the memory. And, from our work, it seems like that's maybe one of the least the thing that most people don't think about, right? Most people think about memory as being a file that exists somewhere or something that's a static representation. And that's not right. It's actually this dynamic building process that happens every time that we retrieve a memory. But so that makes it really easy to either leave out a building block from the very first stage, to have a building block that was there initially, but it didn't get written into the blueprints, to have blueprints that are, erroneous in some way, maybe added in a detail. And sometimes the blueprints are fine, but just in that reassembly process at retrieval, something goes wrong. A very common instance of that is that we blend two memories together. It's almost as if we grab two similar blueprints and we start to kind of combine them. And so we end up blending memories of two different dinners that we had at one restaurant. And now we think that different people were there all at once, when in reality, it was two different experiences. And then that memory that we've rebuilt actually gets restored. Those blueprints get rewritten. And so we're constantly changing and shaping and updating our memories. And so again, it's really the norm that there are actually errors, both things that we're missing and things that we've erroneously added on.
And I'll just add one of the, I think, most interesting things that I'm sure you and your listeners have experienced is that, because these blueprints, as Elizabeth just said, are overwritten, that, you and a friend could have been at the same event You recall the memories separately at different times. You incorporate, slightly different errors into each of your memories. And then you later talk about it, finding these differences. And each of you is absolutely convinced that their version of the event is the accurate one. And it's just amazing that, studies actually that both Elizabeth and I have done, show that people can have amazingly high confidence for memories, even if there's major, distorted or misshapen memories or outright false memories. People still can have incredibly high confidence for them.
It kind of reminds me of, we have an accident that happens, and police come and they take a report. Everyone has a different view of what happened.
Absolutely. And Elizabeth has a great example of that, in the book. It's like if people are paying attention to different things when they're witnessing an accident, when they're thinking about different things based on, who they are and what things are important to them, they can have very different memories for that accident.
So how do we identify these like false memories? How do we put them in order or place or question them?
I think some of it comes down to, first of all, I should say it's hard, right? It's very difficult. And we all probably are walking around with some false memories where we really believe that things have happened in a particular way. And that's not at least quite right. There are some tips that we can use, though. So some of it comes down to trying to figure out if something could have happened that way. So oftentimes we just don't monitor our memories as well as we should, because we have these faulty metaphors and beliefs about memory. And so we assume that they must most of the time be accurate. And so some of it can really come down to questioning a little bit more when the stakes are high. So before you're about to repeat something that you think you read in a reputable news source, to just take that extra moment to monitor and make sure that's actually where you heard it. And it's not something that was just on your Facebook feed from an unknown source or something like that. So sometimes it's really about monitoring in that way. Similarly, it can be about figuring out, do these two things that I think happened, could they both have happened? Or is it the case that, I couldn't have both been in this location and also, in doing this other task on that same, on that same day or in that same week? And so can I then use that to figure out, which of these is actually the correct memory? So a lot of it really can come down to monitoring our memory more rigorously than many of us do. I think that often is the most important piece. And then related to that is also the idea that if something is really distinctive, it makes sense that it would be memorable to us. And so sometimes we can actually use the absence of a memory as indicative that what someone is suggesting to us probably didn't happen. So, if someone tells you that you ate with them at this really fancy restaurant, and it's very rare that you go out for such a nice meal and, get dressed up or whatever, that might be an instance where the absence of a memory is actually a pretty good indicator that what the person is suggesting isn't correct. And so that's another domain where it can be really important, because otherwise someone's suggestions can actually get written into those blueprints, and we can end up falsely believing something because someone has suggested to us that it was true.
So is it possible to really kind of control what we choose to remember and forget?
Yes, you at least can make some headway in that direction. And it's very interesting that I would say the mechanisms of exactly how it works have not been quite worked out, but you can definitely give yourself instructions on like whether you should remember a piece of information or whether you shouldn't. And so part of this happens automatically. So if there is some information that we need to remember, let's say I'm, going to the gym and I'm using one of the temporary lockers, and, I put my, my clothes in the locker, and I, put a combination, and then I have to remember that little combination. So I'm going to tell myself, okay, I need to remember this. So when I finish, my workout, I'll be able to go and remember where the locker is, maybe what number the locker is, and also the code. And that simple extra act of telling myself, okay, I need to remember this, is actually helpful to get it into our memory store. But what's very interesting is that automatically, I know that I can forget that information as soon as I've retrieved it. And it actually does disappear more quickly. Another thing is like with passwords, right? We all have like a million passwords that we're using every day. We always have to remember a new password. Well, if I have a new password, there's two different things I can do. I can either tell myself, okay, this is a password I really need to keep in my mind, in my memory. And so I'm going to work on trying to remember it. Maybe I'll develop a little mnemonic, a little memory trick or an aid to help me remember it. And that's something that we spend a lot of pages in the book talking about, these different sort of strategies that we can use. But even just the act of telling myself I need to remember it helps. But on the other hand, if I say to myself, okay, I'm going to write this down on a piece of paper, and that's how I'm going to remember it, or I'm going to put it in a special password keeper in my phone, and that's how I'm going to remember it. That act is telling my memory, oh, you can forget this because it's offloaded. It's going to be written down, and we will be less likely to remember information that we have offloaded like that. And then the last example, I think Elizabeth has such a beautiful example that she talks about in the book. I'm going to let her talk about how you can snuff out a memory when you're trying to extinguish one.
So the example I gave in the book is from my actual life, which is that I was teaching a class and I tripped over my power cable and nearly fell. Fortunately, did not. And so for quite a few days, every time that I would go back into that classroom, that memory was very prominent. And I was actually finding that it was interfering with my ability to confidently stand up in front of this very large lecture hall. This was in some of my first weeks as a professor. And so it was really to my advantage to try to figure out a way to push this memory out of mind. And fortunately, there had been work to suggest that what you really want to do in those situations is not just to distract yourself from the memory or to try to think of a different memory, but when that memory that you don't want to come to mind starts to come to mind, to just actively try to put it out of mind, kind of visualize, again, snuffing it out like you might a candle, visualize that memory getting smaller and smaller, whatever the kind of metaphor is for you that works, but to really put effort into trying to push that memory out of mind. It doesn't make you forget the event entirely or anything like that. But what it does seem to do is prevent that memory from coming to mind so readily in that particular context. And I certainly found that worked for me, where, after doing that a few times, I could go into the classroom and that wasn't the memory that was coming to mind. And again, now today, I can talk about this memory. I still remember it quite vividly, but it isn't the memory that's coming to mind every time that I walk into that classroom or other classrooms. And so I think it's a really interesting example where we are able to not cause ourselves to forget something, but kind of control the likelihood that a memory is going to be one of the first things that comes to mind when we're in different situations.
So how does our memory change over time?
So I think there are a couple of ways that we can think about that shift in memory over time. I think one of the interesting shifts is that transition from something being more episodic in nature to something being more semantic in nature. So moving from it being that we have a memory of when our teacher first taught us that the Eiffel Tower is in France, or when we first read that in a book, to just simply knowing this as a fact about the world, but completely distinct from any specific memory of where we learned it. And so that is a really important aspect of memory, is that we are able to move from something being something that we learned in a specific context to just being content that we know and that we can use flexibly in a number of different situations. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about that transition is that sleep plays a really critical role in it. So when the brain is resting overnight, even though we use that term, the brain is resting, it's actually not. The brain is actually really active, and it's active in interestingly different ways than it can be during our waking day. And one of the things that sleep seems to facilitate is that ability for us to move information from being about this very particular event that happened bound to a location and bound to other contextual details and to a timeline, to instead being this general factual knowledge that we understand we can link to other pieces of factual knowledge, and that we understand is now content that we can flexibly apply to all sorts of decision-making processes.
There's one other way that I didn't know if you meant how does memory change over time, which is how does memory change as we get older? That's sort of another way that memory can change over time. And I find that fascinating as well. Even in just normal aging, there are a couple things that can happen. And one of them is that it can take a little bit more effort to learn a new piece of information, and whether you're a older adult who's taking a course or learning a new skill, whatever it is, it may take a little bit more time and effort. Information may need to be repeated, perhaps a little bit more than when you were younger, in order to get the information into your memory stores. When you're retrieving information, it can take a little bit longer to get that information out. And sometimes to get the information out, you may actually need a little hint or a little cue that serves to help you retrieve the memory. But as long as the memory got into your memory stores, even if it took a little bit of effort, a little bit of repetition, it should be able to be retrieved as long as there's a hint or a cue or a little bit of extra time.
So how does alcohol affect our brain?
I will say that although I had been sort of aware of this literature for a while, just reading articles as they came out, I was amazed when I really sort of dove into it to prepare to write this section of the book, just how much alcohol and drugs can affect the brain. Alcohol, first thing I'd like to say, we don't think that for, the average adult, a single alcoholic beverage a day, we don't think that is causing any sort of harm at a permanent basis to the brain. But I will say that even a single glass of wine or a single beer or a cocktail, it almost certainly does affect the memory. People are not going to remember things as well. And, when you add on, the number of drinks, it can actually affect it a lot. And one of the things that has become clear from the literature is, Elizabeth was just explaining how important sleep is for our normal memory processes, and for memories to be short-term temporary memories to more long-term permanent memories. And when we drink alcohol, it can reduce our ability to encode or learn new information in the actual setting. So if you're at a cocktail party and you've had a few cocktails, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to learn the people's names that you're hearing. But the sort of almost scary thing is like, let's say that, a day, or two, before the cocktail party, you've been studying for class. Well, it turns out that having, more than one drink, having enough drinks to get you sort of tipsy, is actually going to interfere with your ability to hold on to the knowledge that you studied earlier in the week. It's actually sort of a scary thing because that's some of the period when those memories are being consolidated, going from short-term to long-term. And so that process can interrupt with it. So, I'm not, I don't abstain from alcohol. I have an occasional beer or a glass of wine or whatever. But I'm aware that it is going to affect my memory. And I think, your listeners should be as well. And then, I'll just mention, because I'm a neurologist and I see sometimes people in the clinic who unfortunately have a problem drinking, problems with alcoholism, that when severe chronic alcoholism is combined with poor nutrition, it can cause a devastating permanent damage to the memory system. So that's, the one other thing to be aware of. So other drugs can also interfere with the memory process in slightly different ways, depending upon the drug.
I know that you go through that in your book in such great detail. There's some remarkable research you've done, and it's something that everyone should purchase this book and learn about. We're not going to cover that here today, but make sure to pick up your own copy of Why We Forget and How to Remember Better. It's a chapter worth the read. So let's talk about attitude. How much does our attitude play into our memory?
So I think having a positive attitude is extremely important. So there are so many benefits to being able to stay positive. We mentioned previously that being socially engaged is really important, and having a positive attitude can be part of that. It also turns out that, we did talk about anxiety, but even milder forms of anxiousness, around memory or other things can also really interfere with the ability of our memory system to function as well as it can. And so there again, having a positive attitude, staying relaxed when we do notice that we've forgotten someone's name or are having trouble learning information can be extremely important. So I think there are a lot of different ways in which staying positive can benefit us. It also turns out that we tend to remember experiences that match our mood. And so if we're staying positive, it actually is easier for us to remember past times in our lives when good things have happened, when we've felt good. And that also can mean that we're actually using those memories to help us envision a future that's a little bit brighter. Whereas when we're in a bad mood, all of that starts to reverse. We're more likely to remember the other times when things haven't gone well, and we're more likely to think about a more negative future. So there's a lot of advantage that comes from having a positive attitude in general. Specifically for mindfulness, one of the things that we really emphasize in the book is this fact that memory is an effortful process, and that one of the most important things that we can do to improve our ability to remember any specific piece of information is to focus our attention on that information. If you're at that cocktail party and someone is introducing themselves, the first thing you have to do is be focused and attend to them when they're saying their name and pay attention to that name. It's really easy to say that. It's really difficult to implement that in our daily lives. And a lot of the time, what we'll realize is that we're having a memory failure because we weren't paying attention. I spent way too much of my life running around my house looking for my phone or my keys or other things that I had set down somewhere very absentmindedly, and then had no idea where in the house they might be. And so mindfulness, I think, can be extremely important because it can help us to train ourselves to be better at focusing our attention. And it can also help us to actually kind of catch ourselves in those moments where we're doing one thing, but thinking about something else. And so I think mindfulness in general is a really important practice, but it can also be specifically important for that critical step of focusing attention that has to be the precursor to memory.
And can I ask you, Elizabeth, since you've just spoken about focus, to talk about the other elements of the 4 mnemonic that you created?
Sure. So we talk about this acronym of 4 things that you can do to help get information into memory. The first, and I would say most important, is focus attention. But then the others are organize the information, understand the information, and relate the information. I think especially for people that are trying to learn complex information, those 3 pieces are also so critical. So imagine your password just as a random set of alphanumeric, codes. But then imagine actually creating a sentence out of it and how much easier that would be, or figuring out ways to cluster the letters and to cluster the numbers. That's the idea of organizing the information. Well-organized information is much easier to remember. That's actually why we have phone numbers that are area codes, then 3 digits, then a dash, and then 4 digits. It's helping us to cluster the information in that way to better organize it. The understand piece, again, for complex information is so important. And with students, I think it's often the main block to getting information into memory. They've listened to the lecture, but they didn't really understand how all the different pieces connected. And so they just start trying to memorize a bunch of information where they don't really know the meaning of it and the importance of it. And you have to instead take a step back, actually understand what it is that you're trying to memorize, and then commit it to memory. And the relate piece, I think, can mean a lot of different things depending on the content. It could mean relating someone's name to another person that has that name, making that connection that these names are the same, or this person shares the name with my favorite author, or whatever it might be. It might be relating other content to something that's important to you in some way. So making a kind of mental note of the fact that this person is talking about going on vacation in this location, and that's someplace you've always hoped to travel, and kind of making that link so the next time you see them, you actually can remember where it is that they said that they were traveling. So there are lots of different ways that we can organize, understand, and relate information, but it's really essential that we try to do as much of that as we can after we've focused our attention on that information in order to get it into memory.
So how does nutrition play a part in all of this?
Yeah, so we are what we eat, and it's very important that we fill our bodies with whole foods that are either unprocessed or minimally processed, and that we want to eat I would say, a modified Mediterranean menu of foods. So this would include fish and poultry like chicken and turkey, olive oil, avocados, fruits and vegetables, nuts and beans, and whole grains. Those are all the things that have been shown in hundreds, I think thousands of studies by now to be really good for the brain. People who eat this menu of foods actually perform better over several years on cognitive tests and have lower rates of dementias. And, other foods that are not on that list, such as red meats or sweets or refined sugar, refined flour, white rice, those foods, are not strictly, forbidden, but they should be eaten sparingly. They should just be eaten just sort of once in a while. There's a lot of evidence that, you don't have to be perfect for these diets to be highly beneficial. And so I really encourage people to, not go crazy, not make it a really strict diet, but just most of the time, to try to eat healthy foods. And, once in a while you want to splurge or go off your diet for whatever, fine. But most of the time, those things make a big difference. And while we're talking about that, the other things I would say is that there are some vitamins that you want to make sure you have an adequate level of, and this would include vitamin B12 and vitamin D. And I recommend that people check in with their doctor if they should get their levels checked, or if their doctor just recommends that, oh, sure, you can take a vitamin D3 each day. Do check with your doctor because they can interact with other medications. In my clinic, I check all my patients with memory problems for B12 and vitamin D. But I want to make it clear, I just want to make sure that they have enough. So they're in the normal range. You don't need to go overboard. Taking mega doses is not going to help. And I would say that there are some supplements that are sold that I think people should not spend their money on, because in my review of the literature, there's no good evidence that they show efficacy. And this includes ginkgo biloba, Prevagen, and coconut oil. I don't think there's any evidence for any of those supplements.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. I've heard coconut oil is such a big deal, and it's nice to get the facts around that.
There's just no evidence for those things.
So what we're really looking to do then is to make a lifestyle change?
Absolutely. And I'd like to throw in there probably the most important lifestyle change, which is aerobic exercise. Aerobic exercise is probably the most powerful, potent thing that we can do to produce growth factors in the brain. The release of growth factors in the brain occurs with regular aerobic exercise. The growth factors have been correlated with increased size of a brain structure called the hippocampus, which is critical for forming new episodic memories. And it's also been correlated with memory performance. So, engaging in regular aerobic exercise, and it can be as simple as, walking briskly to your car. Maybe instead of trying to park in the spot that's closest to the shop you're going into, park in a spot that's far away and walk briskly to and from. And these little, extra, 10-minute walks, 5-minute walks, if you can add them up to at least 30 minutes a day, it can make a big difference in your life.
So what is a tip that you can leave our listeners with that they can use today to improve their memories?
Well, the one that I would say that we haven't talked about too much yet is this idea that we can actually thwart our own retrieval. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we perhaps see someone waving to us across the room. This person is familiar, but we can't come up with their name. And we often do two things that make it really hard to come up with a name. First, we get nervous or anxious. And second, we start generating possibilities for what their name might be. We might go through the alphabet. We might think it starts with a certain letter and generate all the possibilities we can think of that begin with that sound. Those are the worst things that we can do. As we've talked about, anxiety is really not good, not helpful for memory. And it turns out that when we start bringing some information to mind, like, is the person's name Sally, we actually inhibit or make it less likely that any related names are going to be able to come to mind. And I think it's often because we're anxious and generating those alternatives that we so often have the experience where it's 10 minutes later, that person is long gone, and now suddenly their name pops into our heads. But it's because we're relaxed now and we're no longer running through all of those possibilities. And so instead of doing those things, really emphasize relaxing, taking some deep breaths, reminding yourself that these sorts of retrieval failures happen to all of us. They're very normal. They're not a sign that something is wrong. And then rather than generating possibilities for what the content might be, what the person's name might be, instead, think back to the last time you saw the person. Think about something else that you do confidently remember about them. Maybe you know something else about their job or their family. Think about those details. And more often than not, when you do that in a relaxed state, the person's name or whatever other information you're looking for will actually come to mind easily.
Well, Andrew and Elizabeth, it has been such an honor to spend this time with you. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
They're welcome to take a look at my website, www.andrewbudson mariannemd.com. And on there is actually links to send me an email or communicate with social media or look at some YouTube videos of some talks that I've given.
And people are welcome to also come to my website, which is BC for Boston College, CanLab, CANLAB.com. And similar to Andrew, we have links there to our publications, to different videos of talking about memory, and also ways for people to reach out to us directly.
Well, Andrew and Elizabeth, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Andrew Budson and Dr. Elizabeth Kensinger, for spending this time with us today to talk about your new book, Why We Forget and How to Remember Better: The Science Behind Memory. On that note, we're going to pause here for a quick moment, and we'll be right back after these messages. I'd like to thank Jason Eastwood at Guitarfulness for sharing his inspiring music and talent with us. His music is known worldwide for cultivating atmospheres of harmony, inner peace, and clarity. Visit Jason's website at guitarfulness.com. Join his newsletter, be part of his community, and download his music. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.